It's great to talk with you.
You bet, Steve. Good to see you.
You've said a lot already about January 6th. I don't want to make you go over everything, but I want to pick up the story in the middle, so to speak. When you were in the vice president's office, inside the Capitol, at what point and how did you come to understand that many people in the crowd were coming after you or wanted to come for you?
They had come onto the Senate floor, my Secret Service detail, while we were debating initial objections that had been filed. And my Secret Service agent, Maximilian, said, "We need to get you out of the building." I rose, I walked across the short lobby to our ceremonial office, confident that we could hold there. But shortly thereafter, my lead Secret Service agent came in and said, "We need to get you out of the building." And I said, "No, we'll stay here." The third time he came in, he was very adamant, and he said, "We need to leave the building." And I put my finger in his chest and said, "You're not hearing me. I'm not leaving. I'm not giving those people the sight of a 16-car motorcade speeding away from the Capitol."
Did you understand at that point that they wanted you, that they were chanting things such as "Hang Mike Pence"?
Candidly, Steve, I did not. I found that out after the fact. But we were very aware, watching the visuals on television, that there was a riot underway. I just was determined to stay at my post. At that point, my daughter helpfully interjected the question, is there somewhere else in the Capitol Dad could go? Because she saw the loggerheads that we'd reached with my Secret Service agent. And he said, "We could take you to the parking garage." And I agreed. And then I touched my wife Karen on the arm and my daughter, and I said, "Let's go." And we walked down to the parking garage below the Capitol building. We could hear the sound of footfall. We could hear chanting, but it was only later that I learned that many people had come to the Capitol looking for me.
When you did learn in hours and days to come, it's my understanding that you had a conversation with a friend of yours, Senator Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma, who gave an interview to the Tulsa World, and he quoted you as saying of President Trump something to the effect of, "After all I've done for him," the idea being that you had been loyal to him and that he had not been perhaps to you. What did it mean to you that that loyalty was not repaid?
Steve, I'd always been loyal to President Donald Trump. He was my president, and he was my friend. But what happened that day angered me. You know, as I looked at the site on our cell phones and on a small television in the Senate office where I was standing and saw people breaking windows and vandalizing a Capitol that I had dreamed as a little boy of serving in, growing up in Columbus, Indiana, and then had the privilege to serve in for 12 years. It just infuriated me. I was struck with a sense of not this, not here, not in America. When the tweet came across from the president saying that I lack courage, it angered me, but I really didn't have time for it. I thought it was a moment where it was clear to me the president had decided to be a part of the problem. I was determined to be part of the solution, and we convened the Republican and Democrat leaders of the Congress and started to work to get the response from the Pentagon and the Justice Department to support all those remarkable people in the Capitol Hill Police that were holding the line against the angry crowd.
I want to ask about the period leading up to that, because of course there was a period of several months leading up to that in
Right.
which the president first predicted and then claimed a stolen election. You write something very interesting in this book. You say that, I believe on November 7th, 2 months before the attack on the Capitol, the race had been called for Joe Biden, and you spoke with Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, and said you were not convinced that there had been sufficient irregularities to change the election. In the period that followed, did you consider yourself saying something in public or even conceding the race yourself, because you were on the ballot too?
Even at that early point, I was not convinced that there was fraud sufficient to change the outcome of the election. And of course, evidence of widespread fraud would never come. But I was concerned about the voting irregularities that had taken place. And I said so all the way up to my correspondence to Congress on January 6th. I mean, there were a half a dozen states around the country, Steve, that in the name of COVID had changed the rules around elections, sometimes through executive action, sometimes through an attorney general's decision. Sure. And in many cases, as my staff briefed me, in many cases they were changes that seemed to benefit Democrat candidates in those states above Republicans. I thought it was important that we have that debate, if only to set the stage for future reform, which I'm glad to see is happening in states around the country.
Granting that your advice to the president is private, could you have told us what you knew at that point?
Look, the core of the president and my confrontation was over the fact that he had a gaggle of outside lawyers that were telling him that as vice president I had unilateral authority to determine which electoral votes to count, which no vice president in American history had ever claimed that authority. Look, the American presidency belongs to the American people alone. But disputes over electoral votes under federal law are decided by the elected representatives of the American people in the Congress. And I thought it was important that we work entirely through that process, uphold the Constitution, uphold the laws of the country, and move our country forward under the rule of law.
I want people to know that you include some of your past speeches in this book and an appendix in the end, including your 2016 convention speech in Cleveland accepting the vice presidential nomination. I was in Cleveland at the time, watched that speech. It's a good speech. I appreciated reading it again.
Thank you.
In that speech, you say Donald Trump is a good man. Not just that he was the man for the moment or the right man or a strong candidate, but a good man. Do you still believe he's a good man?
President Trump was wrong on January 6th in arguing that I had the authority to overturn the election. But I'll always be proud of the record that we created for the American people, Steve. I mean, I joined the ticket because I thought the country was in a lot of trouble. I thought if we stayed on the path that we were on, we would continue to weaken our economy, weaken America's place in the world. And under the Trump-Pence administration, we rebuilt our military, launched the first new branch of our armed forces in 75 years, revived our economy, became energy independent, and of course saw 300 conservatives appointed to our courts at every level. So I'm incredibly proud of the record of our administration. I was proud to work with President Trump throughout. But President Trump was wrong, and his words and actions that day were reckless. They endangered my family and people at the Capitol building, and I'll never hold any other view.
While you're proud of the record, you didn't just call him a good man again.
Well, look, I truly do believe that only God knows our hearts, and I'll leave it to others to make their own judgments. But I must tell you that the president and I enjoyed a close working relationship, and I know it may strike people in a surprising fashion. But in the days after January 6th, when the president asked to meet with me privately, I'd made no effort to reach out to him. The morning after that tragic day, he had said what needed to be said. He condemned the violence. He committed to a peaceful transfer of power. But I told his daughter and son-in-law if he had something he wanted to say to me, I'd hear him out. I went down to the Oval Office and walked to that back dining room where he and I had spent so many hours together. And I will tell you, I sensed that he was remorseful about what had happened. His first question to me was about my daughter and my wife.
Who had been with you at the time?
Who had been with me the entire time. He said, how are Charlotte and Karen? And I said rather sternly, I said, they're fine. I said they were with me the whole time. They wouldn't leave. Then he asked me, were you scared? And I said, no, Mr. President, I was angry. And I made it clear to him I was angry at our differences. But in the days that followed, we talked from time and time again, and when we left the White House, we parted amicably. We even spoke on the phone from time to time after we left office. But Steve, when the president returned to the rhetoric he was using before January 6th, began again to question those of us that had defended the Constitution, I just thought it was important that we go our separate ways, and we have.
If you ran for president, if you were president, what would your purpose be? What would you want to do with the power?
I never imagined I'd have the chance to be governor of this state or vice president of the United States. And so for me and my family, when you say, if we were to run, well, first is we'd run in such a way that we've sought to run the last 20 years, which is we wouldn't run against anybody, we'd run for things. What I've heard from the American people is they want to get back to the policies of the Trump-Pence administration, of a strong military, of free market economics, conservatives on our courts, America standing with our allies, standing up to our enemies. But I think they long for leadership that could unite our country around our highest ideals and demonstrated the kind of respect and civility that the American people show each other every day.
One of the reasons I ask why you'd want to do is because, as I'm sure you know, there's a debate about the future of the Republican Party, and there are some people who advocate what has been called national conservatism, which could be defined different ways, but one way to think of it is, instead of going for small government and limited government, a kind of libertarian approach, maybe you endorse a bigger or more active government that will promote or even impose traditional values. Do you support that way of thinking?
Well, I'm not sure I've heard it put quite that way, but look, I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order. I've said that since my days on talk radio. And so for me, it all comes down to the Constitution, Steve. It all comes down to the limited government republic that our founders enshrined, and that's
so more of the
that's
Ronald Reagan,
foundation
so
that
more
I
of the
stand
Ronald
on.
Reagan idea than the national conservatism idea. Is what I'm.
Ronald Reagan said in his first inaugural address, it's important to remember the states created the federal government didn't create the states. And I think we would do well as a country to seize a moment where we again encourage states to be those laboratories of democracy and innovation that our founders contemplated.
There are now, of course, laboratories of debate on abortion, and abortion was on the ballot in a number of states this fall. In numerous states, people voted in various ways in favor of abortion rights, and it appears that candidates who supported abortion rights did well. What message did you take from that election on that issue?
Well, let me say, I'm pro-life. I don't apologize for it. I'll always cherish the fact that I was vice president in the administration that appointed 3 of the justices of the Supreme Court, that gave us a new beginning for life, that returned the question of abortion to the states and to the American people where it belongs. And now that debate begins. I said in the wake of the Dobbs decision that we haven't come to the end, we've come to the end of the beginning. And I'm determined in however many years I have left on this earth to be a voice for the unborn and to work every day to restore the sanctity of life to the center of American law. But I've said to my fellow pro-life champions, it may take us as long to restore the sanctity of life to the center of law in every state in this country as it took us to overturn Roe versus Wade.
You don't think that this election is the signal of where the country is going on this?
I believe that the candidates that articulated their position on life, wherever that was, protecting the unborn, fared better than Democrat candidates in race after race. But look, I want to concede a point that we have a ways to go in this issue. But I believe that in the most prosperous nation on earth, we ought to be a nation that is grounded in the unalienable right to life and makes it possible for women in crisis pregnancies to go to term or raise that child or give that child up for adoption. But I also think it's just as important as you see states advance pro-life legislation, that they advance legislation not just for the unborn, but for the newborn. I think we have a unique opportunity to demonstrate the deep compassion of the American people and say yes to life with the generosity and the kindness of every American.
One of the most interesting chapters in this book is called Blessed.
Do you like the title?
It's a fascinating title, and it begins with a quote, a biblical quote about persecution. And in the course of the chapter, which is about your faith and people's responses to your faith, you say you've been mocked, that you were the focus of a mania about your faith, that you faced hostility and intolerance, and that Christians generally were insulted and demeaned, and also that your faith had been misunderstood. What is it that people misunderstood?
Well, let me say, Steve, I've never heard any of that from you. But when my wife was attacked for teaching at a Christian school, when one media outlet after another ridiculed our Christian faith from time to time, I was always struck by that because, as I traveled around America, the words I most often heard, and I heard them every day, where people would reach out across a rope line or stop me on a street corner and say, "I'm praying for you." I mean, this is a nation of faith, of different faiths. Some people, I'm a born-again Christian, raised in a wonderful Catholic home, but the American people cherish faith in the overwhelming majority, and yet it seemed to be a subject of a fascination by some in the liberal media.
When you said you were misunderstood in the chapter, I believe you were talking about, in various ways, people in the LGBTQ community. Is there something on issues having to do with sexual orientation and gender that people misunderstand about you?
Well, I write an entire chapter in the book about our experience here in Indiana with the passage of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. I believe President John F. Kennedy said, "To lead is to be misunderstood." And here was a bill in the run-up to the decision legalizing gay marriage by the Supreme Court that was immediately characterized in the media as a license to discriminate, which of course it clearly wasn't, and legal scholars at the time recognized that. I said at the time when I was governor, I don't believe anyone should ever be harassed or discriminated against because of who they are, who they love, or what they believe. But that being said, there are profound implications on this question, as Justice Kennedy wrote in the Obergefell decision, that bear upon religious freedom. And the courts have been sorting through that ever since. I will tell you, I've been encouraged that the Supreme Court has been striking a balance on the issues of religious liberty and individual rights. And I trust that the conservatives on the court will continue to do that. But if there's anything people don't understand well about the Pences is to know Karen and Mike Pence, to know our family, we love everybody. My faith tells me to love your neighbor as yourself, and that's something we aspire to do every day, whether we agree with every view or every value of the people that we meet.
One thing that occurred to me as I read that chapter is that some of the words you use to describe the way you've been treated, I feel that I've heard from people who identify as lesbian or gay or trans, that they faced hostility or a mania, that they've been mocked, that they faced intolerance, that they were insulted, they were demeaned. You probably followed the news of the nightclub shooting in Colorado just in the last few days.
Heartbreaking.
What would you say to reassure, if anything, your fellow citizens who feel that way?
Well, I do believe that it adheres to the American character to show tolerance. It's just who we are. And not just here in the Midwest, but really all across this country. During my time as vice president, my opinion of the American people went up, not down. I've seen the American people in good times, I've seen them in facing natural disasters, and I've seen the incredible generosity. What I write about in So Help Me God is, for many Bible-believing Christians, we perceive what I call the intolerance of tolerance. That in the name of tolerance, people are intolerant
Toward people like you.
traditional views. And I don't argue for a moment that people on the other end of that debate have felt the same way. It's why one of the reasons is that I think we need to get to a place where we recognize again what really the First Amendment is all about, and that is it's the right to live, to work, to worship according to the dictates of your conscience, and to respect one another. I do think it's one of the things I've heard over and over traveling around the country, as I said before, and that I think the American people long for leadership at the national level that shows the respect and civility that Americans show one another every day, whether it's at the grocery store, the gas station, or at work, or at worship, or across a backyard fence. It's just the reality. The American people actually get along pretty well every day because we're a tolerant and a caring and the most generous people in the history of the world. And so I think there is much to be said about a hunger in our country for that kind of leadership, and people say that to me, and I'm humbled because they tend to associate us, at least in our recent career, with aspiring to be that kind of a voice.
I want to impose on you for one more question before I let you go. It is about your youth.
It's about what?
Your youth. You write a fascinating story about a kid who is finding his way in the world. You say that you were 50 pounds overweight and unhappy about it at one point. You lose weight, you gain confidence, you learn to give speeches and win competitions, but you say you end up full of yourself. Later comes a period where you change your faith. How often, when you're going through your political life, do you think about that uncertain, unformed, insecure kid and what he wanted and what he needed?
That kid will always be in me. And he's one of the reasons I have a fundamental distrust of my own ambition. My own ambition has carried me places early in my career that I learned hard lessons. But ever since that time, we've always sought just to kind of reflect, pray, talk to one another as a family, talk to trusted friends, to discern what our calling might be. And whatever the future holds, we know who holds the future, and we'll go where we're called.
Mr. Vice President, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Steve, thank you. It's good to be with you.